Somewhere beneath the cobblestones of Edinburgh's Royal Mile, below the tourist shops and the whiskey bars and the centuries of accumulated stone and memory, there are rooms that have not seen daylight in over 400 years. Not ruins, not rubble, rooms with walls still standing, fireplaces you could crouch beside, plaster still clinging to stone. The city sealed them and forgot them. And when investigators finally found their way back inside, what they discovered changed everything historians thought they knew about why this happened. Edinburgh is extraordinary for many reasons. Its castle sits on the plug of an ancient volcano. Its old town climbs and tumbles down a ridge of volcanic rock that has been continuously inhabited for at least 1,000 years. Its skyline, when seen from the south, looks like something a child drew when asked to imagine what a medieval city should look like. Towers and spires and tenements stacked improbably on top of each other, clinging to the rock as though afraid of falling. But what most visitors walking the Royal Mile on a bright summer afternoon do not realize is that the street they are walking on is not the original street. Beneath their feet, below the modern road surface, below the layers of drainage pipe and electrical cable and the geological sediment of centuries, there is another street. And below that street, there may be parts of yet another one. Edinburgh, like many ancient cities, has not so much grown outward as it has grown upward, building on top of itself, generation after generation, until the original city was not demolished, but simply buried. What makes Edinburgh unusual, however, is not just that this happened. Cities burying themselves is not especially rare. What makes Edinburgh unusual is the way it happened, and the extent to which the buried city survived. In most places, when a city builds over itself, the old structures are dismantled. Stone is reused. Foundations are cleared or built upon in ways that destroy what was there before. The new city cannibalizes the old one. Builders are practical people, and old stone is valuable. It gets incorporated into new walls, repurposed into new foundations, broken up and used as fill material. The idea of simply leaving an old building in place, sealing it off and building on top of it, rather than clearing it first, runs against the instincts of anyone working under the economic pressures that have always governed urban construction. And yet that is, in certain places in Edinburgh, precisely what happened. When construction projects in the 17th century and beyond required new buildings to be raised above the existing street level, the old structures beneath were not always removed. Sometimes they were simply incorporated into the foundations of the new buildings, their rooms becoming cellars, their streets becoming tunnels, their entire existence effectively sealed off from the world above. It was not a decision made in the name of preservation. It was a decision made because it was easier and cheaper and faster to build over what was already there than to clear it away first. The result is that beneath modern Edinburgh, there exists a preserved urban environment of extraordinary historical depth. And at the center of that underground world, the most famous and the most thoroughly studied and the most mysteriously compelling of all the buried places is a close called Mary King's. To understand what a close is, you need to understand how Edinburgh's old town was built and why it was built that way, and why the social and geographical pressures that shaped it produced an urban form unlike almost anywhere else in the world. Edinburgh's Old Town follows the spine of a long, narrow ridge of volcanic rock that runs roughly from east to west, with the castle at the western end sitting on its volcanic plug, and the Palace of Holyrood House at the eastern end, nestled at the foot of the hill. This ridge is called the Royal Mile, though it is slightly longer than a mile, and it has been the central artery of Edinburgh since the city first took recognisable form in the medieval period. The geology that produced this ridge is ancient beyond comprehension. The rock is the remnant of volcanic activity that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago, And the particular shape of the ridge, its steep northern face and its more gently sloping southern face, is the product of glacial erosion during the last ice age, when a massive sheet of ice moving from west to east scoured the softer rock away on either side of the volcanic plug and left the hard basalt of the ridge standing. This geological history is not incidental to the story of Edinburgh's underground. It is fundamental to it. The hardness of the rock, its resistance to erosion, and to the kind of subsidence that undermines buildings in cities built on softer ground, is part of why structures built into and over the rock survive. The Edinburgh basalt does not shift and settle in the way that alluvial or clay soils do. A building placed on it stays placed. A room carved into it remains a room. The underground spaces of Edinburgh endure in part because the rock beneath them is among the most stable building material that exists. The problem with building a city on a narrow ridge is immediately obvious. You have very limited width to work with. The ridge drops steeply on both sides, particularly on the north, and the usable flat ground at the top of the ridge is not much wider than the road itself. This created extreme pressure on the available building land. Edinburgh in the medieval period was not a small settlement that could simply expand outward. It was a capital city, growing in population and in political and economic importance, and it had almost nowhere to go. The solution that Edinburgh's builders arrived at over centuries of incremental development was to build upward. The tenement buildings of the Old Town rose to heights that astonished visitors from other parts of Europe. 6, 7, 8, sometimes 10 or 11 stories tall, these buildings were among the tallest residential structures in the world at the time they were built. They were not luxury apartments in the modern sense. They were densely packed, multi-occupancy buildings where a single floor might be divided among several families, where the wealthy occupied the middle floors and the poor occupied the upper floors, and the lowest floors closest to the street. This vertical arrangement of social class is counterintuitive to modern sensibilities. We tend to assume that upper floors are more desirable, and in modern buildings with lifts and good water pressure and pleasant views, they are. But in an Edinburgh tenement of the 17th century, the upper floors were anything but desirable. They required climbing enormous numbers of stairs to reach. They were furthest from the water supply at street level. They were exposed to the cold winds that swept across the ridge from the Firth of Forth, and they were the floors from which it was most difficult and most dangerous to throw your waste out of the window without hitting someone below, which, in a city without proper sanitation, was a practical consideration of genuine importance. The middle floors were warm. They were close enough to the street to be convenient. They had the protection of the floors above and below against the extremes of temperature. They were the floors that the prosperous merchants and the lawyers and the other professional classes occupied. And in this arrangement, squeezed between the wealthy in the middle and the very poor at the top, were the people of middling status, the skilled tradespeople, the minor merchants, the people who were doing well enough to be above the bottom, but not well enough to be comfortable. And behind these tall buildings, running perpendicular to the Royal Mile and descending steeply down the sides of the ridge, were the closes. A close, in Scottish usage, is an alleyway or a narrow passageway. The word itself comes from the Old French clos, meaning enclosed, and it describes the fundamental characteristic of these spaces. They were not open thoroughfares, but enclosed passages, typically entered through a covered gateway in the tenement fronting the main street, and running back from that gateway into the space behind. In many English cities, similar spaces are called yards or courts or entries. In Edinburgh, they are closes. But in Edinburgh's Old Town, closes were much more than simple alleys. They were entire vertical streets. A close typically began at the Royal Mile with a pend, a covered gateway that led through the ground floor of the tenement building fronting the main road. And then it ran down the hillside, sometimes for a considerable distance, lined on both sides by buildings of its own. These buildings within the close were typically lower than the tenements on the Royal Mile, but they were still substantial stone structures, and they housed families and workshops and small shops and trades of every description. The descent of a close from the Royal Mile down the slope of the ridge could be dramatic. Some closes dropped many metres over a relatively short horizontal distance, with stairs cut into the rock at the steepest points. The buildings on either side rose from the close floor, and because of the slope, the buildings on the uphill side were effectively cut into the hillside, their rear walls formed by the living rock of the ridge itself. This made them cool in summer and relatively stable in terms of temperature throughout the year. But it also made them dark, since the rock face behind blocked the light that might otherwise have entered through the rear windows. The buildings on the downhill side of a close faced a different challenge. Because the ground fell away steeply below them, these buildings often had to be constructed on their own artificial terraces, with the lower floors of the building sitting at the close floor level and extending downward into the slope below in a series of vaulted cellars and subcellars. This created a situation where a building that appeared to be 2 or 3 stories tall when viewed from the close was actually 4 or 5 stories tall when viewed from the ground level below the close, with the additional floors buried in the hillside on the lower side. Each close was a self-contained neighbourhood. It had its own water supply, usually in the form of a well at some point along its length. It had its own social hierarchy, with more prosperous residents closer to the Royal Mile and poorer residents further down the slope. It had its own identity, and it was often named after a prominent resident or a local landmark or a trade that was conducted there. The naming of closes is itself a historical record of the communities that inhabited them. A close named after a tradesman tells you that that tradesman was prominent enough to be identified with the space. A close named after a family tells you that that family was established enough and present long enough to have the space take their name rather than someone else's. The names of Edinburgh's closes, many of which survive in maps and records even where the closes themselves have been demolished or sealed, are a compressed social history of the old town's population over several centuries. By the 17th century, Edinburgh had dozens of these closes running down both sides of the Royal Mile, particularly on the north side where the slope of the ridge is steepest. They created a city that was not just long and narrow, but also genuinely three-dimensional in a way that most cities are not. To move through the old town was not simply to move along a road. It was to navigate a vertical maze of passages and stairs and covered gateways, descending and ascending, passing through archways into enclosed courtyards, emerging onto open landings from which you could see the rooftops of the buildings in the close below you. It was, by all contemporary accounts, a remarkable and somewhat overwhelming place. Visitors from England and from continental Europe who encountered the old town for the first time often wrote about it with a mixture of amazement and horror. The height of the buildings, the narrowness of the passages, the density of the population, the noise and the smell, and the constant movement of people through spaces that seemed impossibly confined. All of this made Edinburgh's Old Town an experience that was unlike anything in the experience of most travellers of the period. It was also, by those same accounts, extremely dirty, extremely crowded, and extremely loud. The English diarist Samuel Pepys visited Edinburgh in the 1660s and was struck by the height of the buildings and the density of the population. He was less struck, in a positive sense, by the smell. Edinburgh had a serious waste disposal problem, which is perhaps the polite way of putting it. The city's residents, living in these towering tenements, disposed of their waste by throwing it out of the windows into the streets and closes below. Each evening, before a set hour, the cry of "Gardez-l'eau" would echo through the closes, a corruption of the French "Gardez l'eau," meaning "watch out for the water," warning anyone below that the windows were about to open. This practice was not unique to Edinburgh, but Edinburgh's particular topography made it more concentrated and more consequential than it was in cities built on flatter ground. In a city laid out on a grid, the waste thrown from windows would at least be distributed across a larger area. In Edinburgh's closes, where the buildings rose high on either side and the passages were narrow enough that waste thrown from one side could easily reach the other, the accumulation of filth was extreme. The street surfaces in the closes were perpetually wet with liquid waste and layered with solid waste that was only partially and irregularly cleared away. The city authorities made periodic attempts to address this situation. There were regulations about when waste could be thrown and how it should be disposed of. There were designated waste collectors, known by various names at different periods, who were supposed to remove the accumulated material from the streets and closes. There were fines for those who violated the rules about disposal times and methods. None of this was entirely effective. The problem was structural. The city was too densely populated for its sanitation infrastructure, and the infrastructure itself was too primitive to cope with the volume of waste being generated. The result was that Edinburgh's Old Town, throughout the 17th century and for much of the 18th, was an environment that modern health standards would consider uninhabitable. Disease was endemic. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy for the urban poor was short by any measure. The same conditions that created the city's remarkable architecture and its vibrant commercial life also created conditions of physical misery for the majority of its inhabitants. And yet people lived in the closes, and worked in the closes, and were born in the closes and died in the closes, and in many cases loved the closes, because they were home.
The social networks that formed within a close, the relationships of dependency and mutual support and conflict and kinship that bound the residents together, were not incidental to urban life. They were urban life. The close was not just a physical address, it was a community. Mary King's Close is one of these closes. It runs off the Royal Mile on the north side, descending the slope of the ridge beneath what is now the City Chambers building. Its history can be traced back at least to the 16th century, and possibly further. The earliest documentary references to the close that have been identified date from the early 1600s, though the physical structures that formed the close are likely older than the first mention of it in the written record. The close takes its name from Mary King, a merchant and property owner who was a significant presence in the close during the early 17th century. She appears in the Edinburgh Council records of the 1630s and 1640s as an independent businesswoman of some standing. This was not entirely unusual for women of her class and time, particularly in burgess communities like Edinburgh, where widows and daughters of merchants could sometimes inherit or continue businesses in their own right. The legal status of such women was complicated, depending heavily on whether they were widowed, unmarried, or married, and on the specific provisions of any relevant inheritance arrangements. But the practical reality was that women like Mary King could and did conduct independent commercial activity in early 17th century Edinburgh, and the records confirm that she was doing exactly that. Mary King ran a cloth-dealing business in the close, and she owned or controlled property within it, and she was substantial enough as a figure that the close took her name during her lifetime or shortly after. The cloth trade in Edinburgh at this period was a significant business. Cloth was an essential commodity, and the merchants who dealt in it occupied an important position in the city's commercial hierarchy. Mary King was not at the very top of that hierarchy, but she was not at the bottom either. She was a businesswoman of the middling sort, with genuine standing in her community. She had children, and those children are documented in the records as well. Her daughter, also named Mary, later became Nicol Edwards' wife, and the close was sometimes referred to as Nicol Edwards Close in later years, reflecting the way in which property and identity transferred through marriage and inheritance. But the name Mary King's Close persisted, and it is the name that has survived to the present day. The persistence of the name through the subsequent centuries is itself a kind of tribute to the woman who bore it, a recognition, however unintentional, that her presence in the close had been substantial enough to leave a lasting mark. The close, in its 17th century form, was a working residential and commercial street, housing people across a significant social range. At the upper end, nearest the Royal Mile, the properties were larger and more valuable, and housed merchants and professional people. Further down the slope, the buildings became smaller and the residents poorer. This gradient of wealth within a single close was characteristic of Edinburgh's old town as a whole, and it meant that the closes were genuinely mixed communities in a way that the street-by-street social segregation of later cities would largely destroy. Within Mary King's Close, you would have found, in the early 17th century, families living in single rooms or small suites of rooms. A single room in a close building of this period was not a modest studio apartment in any contemporary sense. It was truly a single room, often no more than a few meters on each side, in which an entire family might sleep, cook, eat, work, and conduct all the activities of daily life. Privacy was essentially non-existent. The intimacy of family life in such conditions was enforced by the physical reality of the space and the social practices that developed around it. The acceptance of communal sleeping, the shared use of limited facilities, the constant awareness of other people's physical presence were adaptations to conditions that modern sensibilities find difficult to fully imagine. You would have found workshops where craftsmen worked, often in the ground floor spaces of the close buildings. The crafts conducted in the closes included tanning, weaving, metalwork, and dozens of other trades that required space and that produced noise and smell as byproducts of their operation. The close was not a quiet residential street in any modern sense. It was a working environment, and the sounds and smells of work were as much a part of its character as the sounds and smells of domestic life. You would have found storage spaces and stables because animals were a part of the urban economy in a way that is difficult for modern city dwellers to grasp. Horses were used for transport. Cows might be kept for milk. Pigs were common in the poorer areas of the city. The presence of animals in an already densely populated and already poorly sanitized environment added another dimension to the sensory intensity of close life. The close had its own well, as most closes did. The well was not just a convenience, but an essential piece of community infrastructure, and access to it was a matter of genuine importance. In a city without running water, the well was the point at which the community gathered daily, and the management of that access, the rules about who could use it and when, the maintenance of the physical structure of the well itself, were matters that the close community had to organize for itself. It had the smells of cooking and tanning and animal waste and coal smoke and all the other smells that made early modern cities so viscerally present. And it had, above all, people. People going about their daily business, people in argument and in laughter and in grief, and in the ordinary transactions of commerce and neighbourly interaction that make up the texture of communal life. It had, in other words, life. And then, at some point in the 17th century, that life began to change. The close began to be depopulated. The community that had been its reason for existing slowly thinned, as communities do when conditions turn against them. And eventually, when a major new building was constructed across the top of the close and its neighbouring closes in the early 18th century, Mary King's Close was sealed beneath the new structure and effectively removed from the visible city. The question of why this happened and how it happened and what exactly the process was is where the history becomes genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting. Because the standard story that has been told about Mary King's Close for over a century is not quite right. It is not entirely wrong either. The truth is more complex, more layered, and ultimately more interesting than the simple, dramatic narrative that popular history has attached to the close. The standard story, the one that guided tours have been telling visitors for decades, goes something like this. In 1645, Edinburgh was struck by an outbreak of bubonic plague. The outbreak was severe. Many people died. The residents of Mary King's Close, as one of the most densely populated parts of the city, were particularly affected. The city authorities, faced with an uncontrolled epidemic, took the drastic step of sealing the residents of the close inside their homes, effectively quarantining them within the close and leaving them to die. After the epidemic passed, the close was too associated with death and disease to be reoccupied, and it was eventually built over and forgotten. It is a dramatic story. It has all the elements that make for compelling history: the plague, the sealed-in victims, the forgotten city beneath the city. It is the kind of story that explains a complex historical situation in a single, powerful image. And that image is so compelling that it has proved extraordinarily resistant to correction. Even people who know that the historical evidence does not support the story in its full form often find themselves half believing it, because the image of a sealed city is so much more vivid and so much more emotionally satisfying than the truth. The truth, as we will explore in some detail, is a story of gradual decline, of slow depopulation, of the ordinary tragedy of urban poverty, rather than the dramatic tragedy of mass death. But it is, in its own way, equally affecting. And understanding it properly requires understanding what the plague actually was in 17th century Edinburgh, and what the city's response to it actually involved. Bubonic plague had been a recurring presence in Edinburgh, and in Scotland more broadly, for nearly 3 centuries by 1645. The first major outbreak in Scotland had arrived in the mid-14th century as part of the catastrophic pandemic that devastated Europe, killing between a third and a half of the continent's population in the space of a few years. That first outbreak was incomprehensible in its scale and in its speed. It arrived from the continent via the trade routes that connected Scottish ports to the rest of Europe. And once established in a port town, it spread inland through the same networks of trade and travel that connected the Scottish settlements to each other. Subsequent waves had struck at irregular intervals ever since. The disease never fully disappeared from Scotland after its initial arrival. It persisted in the rat populations of the country's ports and trading centres, breaking out into the human population whenever conditions were right, whenever the density of susceptible people in a given area reached the level that would allow the disease to spread efficiently. Edinburgh, with its extraordinarily dense population and its role as a trading city, was among the most vulnerable places in Scotland to such outbreaks. By 1645, Edinburgh had experienced multiple serious plague outbreaks in the preceding century. The city had developed protocols for dealing with plague over the course of these repeated encounters, and those protocols were sophisticated, if brutal by modern standards. They were not the protocols of a city dealing with an unknown or poorly understood threat. They were the protocols of a city that had been dealing with this threat for generations, and had accumulated a body of institutional knowledge about how to respond to it. The standard response to plague in 17th century Edinburgh was not to seal people inside their homes to die. It was to remove them. Plague victims and those suspected of being infected were taken out of the city to designated plague grounds, areas outside the town walls where they could be isolated from the healthy population. These places were called pest houses, or plague grounds, and Edinburgh had established ones on the outskirts of the city that had been used in previous outbreaks. The logic of this approach was sound. By removing the sick from the densely populated urban environment,
the authorities hoped to limit the spread of disease to those who were not yet infected. The process of removal was enforced by plague officials, men appointed specifically to identify the sick, arrange for their transportation to the pest grounds, and manage the practical details of the isolation process. This was dangerous work, obviously, since the plague officials were brought into close contact with infected individuals, and they frequently died of the disease themselves. But the fact that such officials were appointed and that the system functioned at all is evidence that the city's response to plague was organized and institutionalized, not the panicked improvisation that the ceiling story implies. Families were separated in this process. The sick were taken away. Sometimes people never came back, not because they were sealed in, but because they died in the pest houses, or, in some cases, because they managed to escape from the isolation and never returned. The terror of being removed to the pest grounds was real. The mortality rate there was high, and going to the pest ground was understood by Edinburgh's residents as a likely death sentence. People hid their sick. They concealed symptoms. They attempted to move sick relatives out of the city before the plague officials arrived, so that the family would not be broken up. This is documented in the Edinburgh Council records in considerable detail. During the 1645 outbreak, we have records of plague cleaners being employed, of people being removed to the pest grounds, of payments being made for the carting of the sick and the dead. We have records of the fines imposed on people who violated the quarantine regulations, of the attempts by authorities to prevent people from entering or leaving the city during the outbreak. We do not have records, in Edinburgh or anywhere else in Scotland, of entire closes being sealed with residents inside them to die. This does not mean that the plague did not devastate Mary King's Close. It did. The outbreak of 1645 was severe enough that significant portions of Edinburgh's population died, and the Close, being densely populated and occupied partly by people who were too poor to flee or to conceal their sick effectively, would have suffered proportionally. The population of the Close at the end of 1645 was almost certainly significantly lower than it had been at the beginning of the year. Some of that reduction was from deaths in the Close itself. Some was from deaths in the pest grounds. Some was from people fleeing the city at the start of the outbreak before the authorities could stop them. But the ceiling story, the dramatic narrative of people being bricked in and left to die, is almost certainly a later embellishment, layered on to what was actually a more gradual and more mundane process of depopulation and abandonment. The image of the sealed city is a story that emerged in the 19th century, when Edinburgh's underground was being rediscovered and romanticised, and when the historical distance from the actual events of 1645 was great enough that the details had been lost, and the imagination could fill in the gaps with something more dramatic than the truth. What actually happened to Mary King's Close over the course of the 17th century is more complex and more interesting than the plague story suggests, and it takes some time to unravel. After the 1645 plague outbreak, the Close was not immediately abandoned. We have documentary evidence of people continuing to live and work in Mary King's Close for decades after the epidemic. Tax records, legal records, and council records from the 1650s, 1660s, and 1670s all show continued occupation of the Close. It was reduced in population, certainly. It may have had a reputation as an unlucky place, which might have made new residents reluctant to move in. But it was not sealed, and it was not dead. What appears to have happened is a gradual process of social and economic decline over the second half of the 17th century. This was not unique to Mary King's Close. The old town of Edinburgh as a whole was beginning to show the strains of its density and its age. The buildings were old and required maintenance that many landlords were unwilling to invest in. The population density had reached levels that were genuinely unsustainable in terms of the available infrastructure. The wealthier residents were starting to look for ways to live in less crowded conditions, though the new town of Edinburgh that would eventually provide that option was still almost a century away from being built. The less desirable closes, particularly those that had suffered heavily in plague years or that had developed reputations for poverty and crime, began to lose their more prosperous residents first. When a wealthy merchant's lease expired in a close like Mary King's, he did not renew it. He found accommodation elsewhere, in a better part of the old town, or outside the city walls in one of the emerging suburban settlements. The property he vacated was not immediately filled by another wealthy merchant. It was filled by someone a step or two down the social ladder, who was willing to accept less desirable conditions in exchange for lower rent. And that person, when their time came to move, was replaced by someone another step down. And so the social composition of the close shifted, over years and decades, toward the poorer end of the spectrum. This was not a sudden transformation. It was a slow and continuous process of downward social drift, driven by the economic logic of a housing market in which better options were becoming available elsewhere. Mary King's Close, after the trauma of 1645, seems to have followed this trajectory with particular speed. The plague had removed a significant portion of the close's population, and the properties they left vacant were not all immediately reoccupied by people of similar social standing. Some remained empty for extended periods. Others were taken up by poorer tenants who could not afford better. By the late 17th century, the population of the close had fallen significantly from its peak, and the character of the community had changed. The physical fabric of the close was also deteriorating. Buildings that had been well maintained by prosperous tenants were less carefully looked after when those tenants were replaced by people who lacked the resources or the incentive for maintenance. Stone buildings require constant attention. Mortar needs to be repointed. Drainage channels need to be kept clear. External surfaces need to be maintained against the Scottish weather. Without that attention, the process of decay is slow but continuous, and the buildings of Mary King's Close by the late 17th century were showing the effects of neglect. And then came the Royal Exchange. In the early 18th century, Edinburgh's merchants had a problem. They had no purpose-built facility for conducting their business. Unlike London, which had the Royal Exchange, or Amsterdam, which had its Bourse, or the other great trading cities of Europe, which had by this period developed proper commercial infrastructure, Edinburgh lacked a formal exchange building where merchants could meet and conduct transactions in organised conditions. The merchants of Edinburgh had been using the street as their exchange, gathering in particular spots on the high street to conduct their business in the open air. This was unsatisfactory in practical terms, particularly in a city where the weather was frequently wet and cold, and where the streets themselves were in no condition to serve as a comfortable venue for the transaction of important business. It was also unsatisfactory in terms of status. A capital city and major trading centre ought to have proper commercial infrastructure, and the absence of such infrastructure was an embarrassment that Edinburgh's merchant class had been aware of for some time. The decision to build a proper commercial exchange was eventually taken by the Edinburgh Town Council, and the site that was chosen for it was on the north side of the High Street, in the area where the close network descended the slope of the ridge. The site had several advantages. It was in the commercial heart of the city, it was accessible from the main street, and it offered a footprint large enough to accommodate a substantial building. It also had one significant complication. It was occupied. The building that was designed for the site was substantial and ambitious. It was designed in the Palladian style by the architect John Adam, working with the neoclassical idiom that was fashionable in British public building of the mid-18th century, and it was built between 1753 and 1761.
The finished building was an imposing structure, with a colonnaded frontage facing the high street and a courtyard in the centre that was intended to provide the sheltered space in which merchants could conduct their business. The building required a considerable footprint, and the way that footprint was accommodated was by essentially building over the existing closes that occupied the site. This is the key to understanding what happened to Mary King's Close and its neighbours. The Royal Exchange was not built after the closes had been cleared. It was built on top of them. The decision to build over rather than clear was driven by cost and by practicality. Clearing the site would have required demolishing substantial stone buildings and removing the rubble, which was expensive. Building over them, incorporating the existing structures into the foundations of the new building, was cheaper and faster. The lower stories of the existing close buildings became the foundations of the new structure. The upper parts of those buildings, the parts that projected above the new building's floor level, were demolished. But the lower parts, the ground floors, and in some cases the cellars and the sub-cellars of the close buildings, remained. They were simply enclosed by the new construction, their external walls now serving as internal walls within the foundations of the Royal Exchange. The close itself, the open-air street that had run down the hillside, became first a covered passage as the new building was constructed over it, and then, as the construction progressed and the building's structure was completed, it ceased to function as a thoroughfare at all. The pend at the top of the close that had opened onto the Royal Mile was sealed off. The network of rooms that had once been a living neighbourhood became a series of basement and sub-basement spaces within a large public building. The rooms were now accessible, if at all, only through the building above them, through doorways and staircases that connected the basement levels of the new structure to the old close fabric below. These connections were not designed for regular public access. They were maintenance connections, the kinds of passages that exist in large buildings to allow workers to reach the foundations for inspection and repair. For most people using the Royal Exchange above, the rooms and passages beneath did not exist in any meaningful sense. This process was not unique to Mary King's Close. Several other closes in the area were treated in the same way. The construction of the Royal Exchange affected Pearson's Close, which ran parallel to Mary King's Close on the north side. It affected Stuart's Close. It affected other named spaces whose identities are harder to disentangle from the historical record. The result is that beneath and around the city chambers, which eventually took over the building after the Royal Exchange function proved unsuccessful, there is not a single sealed close, but a network of sealed and partially sealed passages, rooms, and spaces that together represent a significant portion of the Old Town's pre-18th century fabric. But the rooms did not disappear. They were not filled in, they were not demolished down to their lowest courses and then buried under rubble. They were simply enclosed, sealed off from the outside world by the construction of the new building above and around them. And in that sealed condition, they were preserved in a way that rarely happens to medieval urban environments. The quality of the preservation is extraordinary by any standard of urban archaeology. The rooms of Mary King's Close, when modern investigators first began to seriously explore them in the 20th century, were found to contain traces of their former occupants in a manner that is unusual in the archaeological record. Because the close had not been demolished and rebuilt, because it had simply been sealed, the objects and materials left by its residents had not been disturbed by the kind of systematic clearance that usually accompanies demolition. Things had been left in place. Layers had accumulated rather than been removed. The sealed environment had protected organic material that would normally have decayed centuries ago. What exactly did those early explorers find? And what have subsequent archaeological investigations revealed about the lives of the people who once lived in Mary King's Close? This is where the history becomes archaeological, and the archaeology becomes, in its way, almost intimate. The exploration of Mary King's Close in any systematic form began in the early 20th century, when the building that had been constructed over the site was being used as Edinburgh's city chambers. The building had various basement levels that were known to exist but not fully mapped. Workers and maintenance staff had occasionally encountered the old rooms in the course of their work, stumbling through a door that led unexpectedly into a 17th century room rather than a modern storage space. There were local legends, as there often are with such places, about the extent and nature of what lay beneath. The first serious exploration that generated any kind of documentation appears to have been undertaken in the early decades of the 20th century, and it revealed what the explorers described as remarkably well-preserved rooms from the 17th century. The walls were standing at their full height in many cases. The fireplaces were intact, their stone construction essentially undamaged. In some rooms, plaster still adhered to the walls, preserving the surface finish that the original occupants had applied and lived with. In others, the bare stone of the original construction was exposed, showing the building technique of the period in close detail. The rooms varied in their state of preservation. Some were dry and relatively stable, benefiting from the sealed conditions and from the fact that the rock around and beneath them was impermeable to water. Others had been affected by the infiltration of moisture from the layers above, from drainage water finding its way down through the construction of the Royal Exchange building, and in these rooms the plaster had deteriorated or fallen away, and the stone surfaces showed the effects of prolonged damp. Some rooms had been used for storage or other purposes in the centuries since they were sealed, and contained materials from later periods mixed in with the original fabric. Bottles and containers from the 19th century sat alongside pottery fragments from the 17th. The basement storage functions of the city chambers had occasionally intruded into the old close spaces, bringing later material into an earlier context. But other rooms appeared to have been untouched since they were sealed in the 18th century, or possibly even before, their contents undisturbed by any subsequent human activity. Among the most evocative finds from the exploration of the close was what appeared to be domestic material from the period of occupation. Fragments of pottery of the types used in everyday domestic life in 17th century Edinburgh, remnants of leather goods, the physical residue of daily life in the most literal sense. Because the close had been a working residential neighbourhood rather than a palace or a church, these finds were not artistically significant in the conventional sense. There was no fine silverware, no painted portraits, no elaborately carved furniture. What there was, instead, was the material record of ordinary lives, the kind of evidence that is usually lost because ordinary people's possessions are not considered worth preserving, and because the ordinary environments of ordinary life are not protected and maintained as the environments of the powerful are. The well that had served the close was located and examined. It was a substantial construction, the kind of investment that a community makes in its shared infrastructure when it expects to use that infrastructure for generations. Fireplaces that had heated these rooms for generations were examined in detail. The construction techniques of the buildings were studied, revealing information about how these structures had been built and maintained and modified over time, how different phases of construction related to each other, how the close had grown and changed over the course of its occupation. What the archaeology confirmed was something that the documentary record had suggested, but that the popular imagination had resisted. The close had not been suddenly and catastrophically sealed at the time of the plague. The evidence pointed instead to a gradual process of abandonment over the latter part of the 17th century, followed by the final sealing of the space when the Royal Exchange was built in the mid-18th century. There was no single dramatic moment of closure. There was instead a long, slow withdrawal, as the community that had given the close its life gradually dispersed or died. This matters because it changes the nature of the story. The plague-sealed city is a story about trauma, about a community catastrophically cut off. It has a clear villain in the form of the city authorities who ordered the sealing, and it has clear victims, the residents left to die behind sealed walls. It is a story with the shape of a horror narrative, and that shape is part of what has made it so persistent. The actually happened story is subtler and in some ways more melancholy. It is a story of a neighborhood that slowly declined, that lost its prosperous residents first and then its poorer ones, that became over time a less and less functional part of the city, and that was eventually simply built over when a new public building required the site. There is no villain in this story, or rather, the villain is the impersonal logic of economics and urban development, which does not make for a satisfying horror narrative, but which is far more characteristic of what actually happens to communities in declining neighborhoods of old cities.
And yet the plague does not disappear from the story entirely. Because even if the sealing was gradual rather than sudden, even if the depopulation was a process rather than an event, the plague of 1645 was a real and devastating moment in the history of the Close. It was the trauma that initiated the decline, the event that broke the community's momentum and set it on the trajectory that would end with the Close being built over a century later. In the rooms of Mary King's Close, archaeologists and investigators have encountered what they describe as a genuine heaviness of atmosphere. This is, of course, a subjective observation, and it means different things depending on the interpretive framework of the person making it. For those inclined toward paranormal explanations, the atmosphere of the Close is evidence of something beyond the physical, the residue of suffering, the presence of the dead. For those with a materialist worldview, it is simply the product of the space itself, the low light and the enclosed air, and the accumulated stone of centuries, interacting with the knowledge of what happened here. But almost everyone who has spent time in the Close, regardless of their beliefs, notes that it produces a particular kind of feeling. And that feeling is not, interestingly, one of fear. Most people describe it instead as something more like sadness, as a sense that the space carries the weight of the lives that were lived within it, and that those lives were not easy lives, and that the Close holds that difficulty in its stone and its plaster and its air. Whether that is a paranormal phenomenon or a psychological one, whether it is something real in any objective sense, or simply the product of imagination and knowledge interacting with space, is a question that each visitor must answer for themselves. But the feeling is real enough that it is worth taking seriously as data, if not as evidence of anything specific. After the Royal Exchange was built and the Closes were sealed, the story of what lay beneath did not simply stop, because the sealing was never quite complete. There were points of access, there were people who knew what was down there, and there were, in some cases, people who continued to use the lower levels of the closed network for various purposes that were not connected to any interest in historical preservation. Edinburgh's underground, it turns out, was not entirely underground in the sense of being inaccessible or unknown. The City Chambers building that took over the Royal Exchange maintained various basement and sub-basement levels that connected to the old closed network. Maintenance workers had access to these areas in the course of their regular duties. Storage was sometimes kept there, and the Close was not entirely forgotten by the local population. It was a feature of local knowledge, talked about by Edinburgh residents who knew, in the way that people always know about the strange and hidden things in their own neighbourhoods, that there was something beneath the street. What is fascinating, and what is often overlooked in popular accounts of the underground city, is the extent to which people continued to live in some of the lower levels of the closed network well into the 18th and even the 19th centuries. Not in Mary King's Close itself, which appears to have been effectively sealed at a relatively early stage of the construction process,
but in associated spaces and in parts of the closed network that were not completely enclosed by the new building. There are records from the mid-18th century and later of people living in what were described as underground or semi-underground conditions in the area of the Royal Mile. These were not people who had been sealed in. They were people at the very bottom of Edinburgh's social hierarchy, living in whatever spaces were available to them, and some of those spaces happened to be the lower levels of the old close network. The spaces were accessible to them through connections that the building above had not completely sealed, or through points of entry that the maintenance staff knew about and that had not been formally blocked. This is a reminder that what we think of as the dramatic moment of sealing, the transformation of a living street into an archaeological site, was not a clean event with a precise date. It was a messy, gradual process with fuzzy edges at both ends. The community had been declining for decades before the building was constructed, and the boundary between the living city and the buried city remained permeable for decades after the construction was complete. The most famous piece of documentation for this kind of continued underground habitation comes from a report attributed to Robert Chambers, the Scottish publisher and author who wrote extensively about Edinburgh in the early 19th century. Chambers described encountering an old woman who was living in one of the underground closes, in a room that had been sealed off from the street above for decades. She had no window. She had no source of daylight. She lived by lamplight in the full sense of the phrase, going about her daily domestic activities in a space that most people would have considered uninhabitable. Chambers found this both affecting and alarming. The woman herself, by his account, seemed perfectly comfortable with her circumstances. She had adapted entirely to the underground life, to the permanent dimness, to the enclosed air, to the particular quality of existence that comes from living in a space that the rest of the city has forgotten. She was not a prisoner. She was there by choice, or at least by the logic of her economic situation, which had left her with a choice between this underground room and no room at all. This story points to something real about the social geography of Edinburgh in this period, that the extreme poverty of the lower depths of the city's population meant that any habitable space, however strange, however dark, however far from the visible city, might be occupied by someone who had no better option. The underground closes were not, in this period, archaeological sites being preserved for future study. They were marginal spaces being used by marginal people, in the way that any available space in a city of poverty is used by those who cannot afford to be selective about where they live. The underground habitation continued until the 19th century brought new developments in Edinburgh's understanding of and approach to its underground spaces. The gradual improvement of drainage and urban infrastructure meant that some of the underground areas became better mapped and better understood by the city's administrators. New sanitation legislation and housing regulations, driven by the public health reforms that swept British cities in the Victorian period, eventually extended their reach even to these hidden spaces. The people who had been living in the underground gradually moved, or were moved, to other parts of the city, and the closes settled into their long sleep. Their doors were sealed, their air went still, and the city above them continued to change and to grow and to forget that they were there. The serious archaeological attention to Mary King's Close began in earnest in the 20th century. The initial explorations were not systematic investigations, but informal explorations by people who were curious about what lay beneath the city they lived and worked in. The stories they brought back were dramatic, and they contributed to the growing mythology of the underground city, the popular conception of Edinburgh as a place with secrets beneath its feet. The formal archaeological investigation of the site began in more recent decades, as Edinburgh's cultural and heritage institutions came to recognise the significance of what lay beneath the city chambers. The challenge of archaeological investigation in a site like this is considerable. The close is not a buried site in the conventional sense, where material has been deposited over time and can be excavated layer by layer. It is a ceilings that have been in place for centuries. The archaeology is embedded in the structure of the buildings themselves, in the relationships between different phases of construction, in the physical fabric of the walls and floors and fixtures. This means that the archaeological method must be adapted significantly from what would be used on a more conventional excavation site. The investigation of Mary King's Close has relied heavily on historical documentation, on architectural analysis, on the study of material culture found within the rooms, and on the careful mapping of the surviving physical structure. It has required the collaboration of historians and archaeologists and architectural historians and conservators, each bringing their own expertise to a site that does not fit neatly into the usual categories of archaeological investigation. What this investigation has revealed is a remarkably detailed picture of the close in its final period of occupation. The rooms preserve evidence of how they were used, in the construction techniques employed, in the physical configuration of the spaces, in the remnants of fixtures and fittings that have survived the centuries in the enclosed environment. One of the most striking aspects of the archaeological record is the evidence for the social stratification that characterized the close, even within a single building. The rooms at different levels and in different positions within the close show significantly different levels of finishing and investment. The upper floors and the rooms nearest the Royal Mile show evidence of more elaborate plasterwork, of more sophisticated construction techniques, of higher quality materials overall. The lower floors and the rooms further from the main street show simpler construction, less decoration, more utilitarian approaches to the building of the space. This is entirely consistent with what we know about the social geography of the Old Town from documentary sources. But seeing it in the physical fabric of the buildings, in the actual surviving stone and plaster, makes it visceral in a way that reading about it in historical documents does not. The social hierarchy of the close is not an abstraction. It is written into the walls, into the quality of the plasterwork, and the size of the windows and the details of the fireplace surrounds. You can read it directly, with your eyes and your hands, in a way that is different from any intellectual understanding. The archaeology has also shed light on the commercial activities that were conducted in the close. Analysis of the spaces and their configuration suggests the presence of workshop areas, storage spaces, and other commercial uses alongside the purely residential functions. The ground floor spaces in particular show evidence of having been used for purposes other than simple habitation, with features that are more consistent with commercial or craft use than with purely domestic activity. The well within the close, which has been located and examined, provides evidence of the water supply arrangements that were so crucial to life in the Old Town. Access to clean water in a city as densely populated as 17th century Edinburgh was a constant challenge, and the wells within the closes were essential infrastructure. The physical construction of the well, the stonework and the lining, and the surrounding arrangements for drawing and storing water tells its own story about the investment that the close community made in its shared resources. The fireplaces in the surviving rooms are perhaps the most immediately evocative physical feature of Mary King's Close. They are stone constructions of varying sizes, from quite modest openings that could heat a small room to larger fireplaces that might have served both heating and cooking functions in the same space. In a city where coal was the primary fuel for domestic heating by the 17th century, and where the smoke from thousands of fires produced the layer of visible pollution that contributed to Edinburgh's nickname of Old Reekie,
meaning old smoky, the fireplace was the heart of every room. To stand in front of a fireplace in Mary King's Close, a fireplace that has not had a fire lit in it for centuries, is to feel the absence of warmth in a particularly literal way. The investigation has also involved the collection and analysis of organic material that has survived within the enclosed environment. This includes plant material, food remains, and other organic evidence of daily life. The preservation of such material in an urban environment is unusual, since organic material typically decomposes rapidly in the conditions that characterize most urban sites. The sealed nature of the close, combined with the particular conditions of temperature and humidity that have prevailed within the enclosed space, has allowed some organic material to survive that would normally be lost within years of deposition. The analysis of these materials has provided insights into the diet and domestic habits of the close's former residents that documentary sources cannot offer. What people ate, how they prepared food, what plants they kept in their homes or used in their daily lives. These are aspects of historical existence that are rarely preserved in the documentary record, but that leave traces in the material record if conditions allow. We should pause here and think about what it means that Edinburgh has this. What it means that beneath one of Europe's most visited cities, there is a preserved urban environment from the 17th century that can still be walked through, that still has its walls standing and its fireplaces intact, that still carries in its physical fabric the evidence of the lives that were lived within it. Most of the 17th century city is gone. In Edinburgh itself, the buildings of the old town that are still standing have been modified and modernised and adapted so many times that they bear little physical resemblance to what they were when Mary King was conducting her cloth trade in the close below. The process of modernisation has been continuous and relentless. Every generation has found the buildings of the previous generation inadequate in some respect and has modified them accordingly. The result is that what we see in the standing buildings of the old town is not the 17th century, but a palimpsest, a surface that has been written on and rewritten so many times that the original inscription is almost entirely obscured. What Mary King's Close represents, in this context, is something precious and genuinely unusual. It is a fragment of the pre-modern city that has survived not through deliberate preservation, but through the accident of its sealing. Nobody preserved it because they thought it was important. It was preserved because it was forgotten, because the people who built the Royal Exchange over it found it more convenient to leave it than to clear it, and because no subsequent generation found sufficient reason to clear it either. Mary King's Close is the most famous of Edinburgh's buried closes, but it is far from the only one. The construction of the Royal Exchange over the close network in the mid-18th century affected several other closes besides Mary King's. Pearson's Close, which ran parallel to Mary King's Close, was similarly sealed beneath the new building. Stuart's Close, and others whose names appear in early maps and records of the old town, were affected by the same construction process. The result is that beneath and around the city chambers, there is not a single sealed close, but a network of sealed and partially sealed passages, rooms and spaces that together represent a significant portion of the old town's pre-18th century fabric. The full extent of this underground network is still not completely known. Different investigators have mapped different portions of the area at different times and with different degrees of rigour. What is clear is that the area is larger and more complex than early popular accounts suggested, and that there are portions of the underground network that have not been thoroughly investigated even to this day. Beyond the area immediately beneath the city chambers, Edinburgh's underground is more extensive still. The South Bridge vaults, which are a separate and distinct set of underground spaces in the southern part of the Old Town, were created in the late 18th century,
when the construction of the South Bridge over a valley required the building of a massive arched structure beneath the road surface. The spaces within those arches were initially used for commercial purposes, but as they became damp and difficult to use, they were gradually abandoned and eventually sealed. Like Mary King's Close, they were later rediscovered and opened to visitors. The South Bridge vaults are structurally and historically distinct from the Mary King's Close network, and they tell a different story. Not the story of a residential close gradually depopulated over a century, but the story of commercial spaces that failed commercially and were repurposed for increasingly marginal uses before being abandoned. But they represent the same general phenomenon: the underground accumulation of a city's past, preserved not through intention, but through neglect. Beyond these two major underground systems, Edinburgh contains many other buried features that are less well known and less accessible. The geology of the city means that cellars and subcellars are extremely common in the Old Town, and many of these connect to older structures in ways that are not fully understood. Building work in the Old Town regularly uncovers unexpected features, pieces of medieval or early modern construction that appear in contexts where they were not expected. The question of what remains undiscovered beneath Edinburgh is genuinely open. The city's Archaeological Service maintains records of what has been found and investigates finds as they come to light. But the dense and complex nature of the urban fabric means that the complete picture of what lies beneath the Royal Mile is still far from clear. There are sections of the medieval city's defences, the town wall that surrounded the built-up area of Edinburgh in the medieval period, that are only partially traced. There are foundations of buildings that appear in historical records, but whose physical remains have not been definitively located. There are stories, less reliable but not entirely dismissible, of tunnels connecting various points within the Old Town, passages that may have been used for various purposes at various points in the city's history. The tunnel stories are particularly interesting as a cultural phenomenon, even where they cannot be verified archaeologically. Almost every old city in Europe has its underground tunnel legends. Stories of passages connecting the castle to the cathedral, or the monastery to the river, or the merchant's house to a secret escape route. These legends are almost always embellished and sometimes entirely invented, but they are not always entirely fictional, and the frequency with which they appear in the traditions of old cities suggests that they may preserve a cultural memory of the genuine utility of underground passages in periods when cities were more physically dangerous and politically volatile than they are today. In Edinburgh's case, there are accounts of tunnels connecting the castle to various points in the city below, including possible connections to Holyrood House at the other end of the Royal Mile. The castle is built on a volcanic plug that rises dramatically above the surrounding terrain, and any tunnel connecting it to the lower city would require significant engineering. Some investigations have found evidence of passages or chambers within the castle rock that might be consistent with the existence of such connections, but the complete picture remains unclear, and the more dramatic claims remain unverified. What is clear is that the rock on which Edinburgh Castle sits is extensively honeycombed, with natural caves and human-made chambers. The volcanic geology that produced the rock plug also produced fractures and cavities within it, and these have been exploited by humans throughout the castle's long history, for storage, for prison cells, for various other purposes. The castle rock is, in a sense, as much underground architecture as it is solid geology. Let us now spend some time thinking about the people who lived in Mary King's Close in its final decades of active occupation. In the second half of the 17th century, after the plague had passed and before the close was sealed beneath the Royal Exchange. Who were they? What do we know about their lives? What can we reconstruct of the daily existence of a community in one of Edinburgh's closes in this period? The documentary record for this period, while incomplete, is more substantial than many people assume. Edinburgh, in the 17th century, was a city with sophisticated administrative structures, and those structures generated records. The Edinburgh Burr records, which are among the most complete civic records from any British city of this period, contain information about property, taxation, legal disputes, and administrative matters that can be used to reconstruct something of the social geography of the closes. The tax rolls of the period allow us to identify who was living where, at least in broad terms. We can see which closes had concentrations of particular trades, which had a mix of social levels, which were dominated by single families or single trades. Mary King's Close, in the period for which we have the best records, emerges as a genuinely mixed community. It had its share of skilled tradespeople and minor merchants, alongside the more casual labourers and the very poor. It was not a slum in the full Victorian sense of that word, but it was not a prosperous enclave either. It was a place where people of modest means lived modest lives and tried to get by. The legal records are particularly revealing. The Edinburgh courts dealt with disputes of all kinds, including disputes about property and tenancy within the closes. These records can sometimes identify specific individuals and specific spaces within the close network, giving us a glimpse of the texture of community life that more formal administrative records cannot provide. Disputes about noise, about the maintenance of shared spaces, about the behaviour of neighbours. These are the ordinary frictions of communal life that leave traces in the legal record when they escalate to the point of formal complaint. What emerges from these sources is a picture of a community under sustained pressure in the second half of the 17th century. The post-plague period was not an easy time for Edinburgh's poor. The city's economy was struggling with the aftermath of the epidemic and with the broader political disruptions of the mid-century, which had seen Scotland involved in the complex and damaging conflicts that swept Britain during the Civil War period and the subsequent years of political instability. In Mary King's Close, the post-1645 period was one of gradual physical deterioration and social thinning. Properties that had been vacated by plague victims were not always immediately reoccupied. Buildings that had been maintained by prosperous tenants were less well looked after when those tenants were replaced by poorer ones who lacked the resources for maintenance. And then came the winter of 1685, which is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it illustrates something important about life in the closes at this period. Edinburgh in the 17th century experienced several exceptionally cold winters, what we now understand as part of the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of climatic cooling that affected northern Europe from the 14th to the 19th centuries. These cold winters had significant effects on urban populations, particularly on the poorest residents of cities like Edinburgh, who lived in inadequately heated spaces and who were frequently malnourished and therefore more vulnerable to the physical stress of extreme cold. The winter of 1685 was particularly severe. Contemporary accounts describe extreme cold, frozen waterways, and the kinds of conditions that killed people who lacked adequate shelter and fuel. In the closes of the old town, where the buildings blocked what little winter sun there was, and where the air was always damp and cold, such a winter would have been genuinely life-threatening for the most vulnerable residents. By the early 1690s, the records of the close show a population that has been significantly reduced from its mid-century peak. There are still people there. There are still disputes, still tax records, still occasional legal proceedings that mention the close. But the community is thinner, older, poorer. The younger and more mobile members have moved on to other parts of the city. What remains is a residual population, people who have fewer options or who have simply been in the close for so long that they cannot imagine being elsewhere.
These are the people who were still in the close when the plans for the Royal Exchange were being developed, and their fate, once the construction began, is a question that the documentary record addresses only partially and obliquely. The formal records of the construction process do not include detailed accounts of the displacement of residents from the affected closes. This is not surprising. The displacement of poor urban residents to accommodate new construction was not, in the 18th century, a process that generated much documentation. It happened constantly, across all British cities undergoing development, and it was largely invisible to those who were not directly affected. The people displaced from Mary King's Close in the 1750s would have been scattered and made individually invisible in exactly the way that displaced populations always are. They would not have been mentioned in the records of the new building's construction. They would not have been commemorated. They would simply have ceased to be part of the close, and the close would have ceased to be part of the city. Except that it was still there. Sealed beneath the new building, its rooms intact, its walls standing, its fireplaces cold, waiting. The phenomenon of cities building on top of themselves is not peculiar to Edinburgh. It is a universal feature of long-established urban settlements, and it has been studied and documented in cities across the world and across the historical record. Rome is perhaps the most famous example. The modern city sits on layers of historical occupation that in some places descend to depths of many meters, with the medieval city built on the ruins of the ancient city, the Renaissance city built on the medieval city, and so on, in layers of continuous occupation that span 2,000 years. Constantinople, the city known today as Istanbul, presents a similar layering. The Byzantine city built on the foundations of the Greek city, the Ottoman city built on and around the Byzantine remains, the modern Turkish city inhabiting spaces that have been continuously occupied for nearly 3,000 years. The underground of Istanbul contains Byzantine cisterns of extraordinary scale, Roman infrastructure of various kinds, and pre-Roman traces that push the occupation of the site back into prehistory. In Chicago, a different and more recent version of the same phenomenon occurred. The city, established in the mid-19th century on flat and flood-prone ground at the southern end of Lake Michigan, was raised nearly 2 meters in the 1850s and 1860s as part of an effort to improve drainage and prevent the flooding that had plagued the original settlement. The raising of the street level was accomplished by placing new foundations beneath existing buildings and physically lifting the structures, while the original street level became, effectively, underground. The spaces at the original street level became the Chicago Underground, a system of tunnels and basement spaces that served various purposes over the subsequent decades.
But Edinburgh's case is distinct from these others in an important way. In Rome, the layering is primarily the result of the demolition and reconstruction of buildings over time, with new structures built on the rubble and foundations of old ones. In Edinburgh, the old structures survived largely intact. The buildings of Mary King's Close, the actual walls and floors and fireplaces of the rooms, are still standing. This is not a site where the past has to be reconstructed from fragments and inferred from deposits. It is a site where the past is physically present in 3 dimensions, where you can walk through it and touch it, and stand in spaces that people stood in 400 years ago. This makes Edinburgh's underground qualitatively different from most other buried city environments. It is not archaeological in the usual sense of that word, not a site where the evidence is scattered and fragmented and has to be painstakingly pieced together. It is something closer to a time capsule, an environment that has been preserved in a state that allows it to be experienced rather than merely studied. The conservation of Mary King's Close presents ongoing challenges. The sealed underground environment has its own microclimate, its own patterns of temperature and humidity, its own vulnerability to deterioration. The opening of the close to visitors, while beneficial in many ways, introduces new stresses. The warmth and moisture of human bodies, the vibration of footsteps, the disturbance of an environment that had been stable for centuries. Managing these stresses requires ongoing monitoring and careful management. The conservation team responsible for the site faces decisions about how to balance the needs of visitor access with the imperative of preservation, how to allow people to experience the space without causing it to deteriorate more rapidly than it otherwise would. These are not unique challenges. Every historic site open to the public faces versions of the same dilemma. But in a site as unusual and as irreplaceable as Mary King's Close, the stakes feel particularly high. The archaeological investigation of the site is also ongoing. The systematic study of the material culture within the close, the detailed architectural analysis of the surviving structures, and the integration of archaeological findings with the documentary record are all works in progress. Each new study adds to the picture, and each addition changes the interpretation of what we already knew. The history of Mary King's Close is not a settled narrative. It is an active research program, and the story it tells is still being written. There is, finally, a question that hovers over all of this, a question that is easy to ignore when you are focused on the details of history and archaeology, but that becomes impossible to avoid if you step back far enough. The question is this: what does it mean that we are drawn to these buried places? The popularity of Mary King's Close as a visitor attraction, the consistent fascination that Edinburgh's underground has exercised over people for centuries, the fact that this particular piece of history has captured the imagination in a way that other equally significant historical sites have not. All of this points to something in the human response to buried places that is worth thinking about. Part of the answer is surely the physical immediacy of the experience. To stand in Mary King's Close is to stand in a 17th century room, in a way that reading about 17th century Edinburgh never can be. The physical presence of the past, its tangibility, its refusal to be merely conceptual, produces a response that is qualitatively different from the intellectual engagement with historical documentation. But there is something else as well. Something about the specific nature of these buried places, their hiddenness, their preservation beneath the visible city. The fact that they were not intended to survive, but did. There is a quality to Mary King's Close that preserved museum artifacts do not have. A quality of involuntary survival, of having been preserved by accident rather than design. The rooms did not survive because someone thought they were worth preserving. They survived because they happened to be in the way. This accidental quality makes them, paradoxically, more moving than deliberate preservation often does. A museum display is curated, managed, presented with the audience in mind. Mary King's Close is none of these things at its core. At its core, it is simply a place that remained while the world above it changed, that held on to the physical traces of lives that were lived in it, that waited in the dark for centuries until someone came looking. The people who lived in Mary King's Close did not know they were living in a place that would one day be visited by thousands of people curious about their lives. Mary King herself, running her cloth trade in the Close in the 1630s and 1640s, could not have imagined that her name would attach to a place that would be explored and studied and argued about 4 centuries after her death. The family living in a single room at the bottom of the Close, the craftsman working in the ground floor workshop, the child growing up in the narrow space between towering stone walls. None of them knew they were making history. And yet, here we are, standing in their rooms, trying to reconstruct their lives from the physical evidence they left behind. The close is their monument, unintended but genuine. And the interest we take in it is, perhaps, our acknowledgement that the lives of ordinary people in an ordinary neighbourhood of an early modern city are worth knowing about, worth preserving, worth the effort of scholarship and the time of the visitor. The buried city beneath Edinburgh is not spectacular in the way that ancient temples or medieval cathedrals are spectacular. It is not grand, it is not beautiful, at least not in any conventional sense. What it is real. The rooms are small and cold and dark. The fireplaces are unlit. The plaster is damaged and the stones are damp, and the air has the slightly stale quality of all enclosed underground spaces. But the walls are standing. The fireplaces are there, and in the specific quality of that presence, in the stubborn fact of survival in a world that was not designed for it, there is something that speaks to us across the centuries, in a way that grander monuments sometimes do not. Edinburgh is built on its own past. Every city is, in a sense, but Edinburgh has had the unusual fortune, if fortune is the right word, of having a portion of that past preserved intact beneath its feet, waiting to be found. And the finding of it, the slow work of understanding what it was and what it means, is a story that is still being told. The close is still there, the rooms are still waiting, and the city above goes on. If you found yourself pulled into the quiet strangeness of this history, hit subscribe. There are more places like this, buried beneath more cities, waiting to be understood. We cover them here, one at a time, without rushing. The next video is already on screen. There is a question that serious historians of Edinburgh have been debating for some time, and it concerns not Mary King's Close specifically, but the broader phenomenon of Edinburgh's underground. The question of whether what we have found is representative or exceptional. Is Mary King's Close a sample of what Edinburgh's buried fabric looks like across the board, or is it an unusually well-preserved outlier, a lucky accident in a landscape where most of the comparable material has been damaged or destroyed? The answer, as best as historians and archaeologists can determine, is that it is both. The preservation of Mary King's Close is genuinely unusual by any standard. The combination of factors that produced it, the particular way the Royal Exchange was constructed, the relative stability of the underground environment, the absence of serious water infiltration in the most important parts of the close, the failure of subsequent generations to disturb the space, is not something that could be expected to replicate itself reliably across all the other buried spaces of the Old Town. Many of those other spaces have not survived in anything like the same condition. But the Close is also not entirely alone. There are other spaces beneath Edinburgh's Old Town that preserve elements of the pre-modern urban fabric in states that, while less complete than Mary King's Close, are still historically significant. The question of what exactly survives, and where, and in what condition, is one that ongoing investigation continues to address. The work of understanding Edinburgh's underground is not purely a matter of historical scholarship. It is also a matter of practical urban management. The Old Town of Edinburgh is a living city, not a museum, and the decisions made about its development and maintenance have real consequences for the preservation of what lies beneath. Every time a building in the Old Town is modified, every time a road is repaired or a utility pipe is replaced, there is the possibility of encountering material from the buried city. Managing those encounters,
ensuring that finds are properly recorded and that decisions about what to preserve and what to disturb are made with full awareness of the significance of what is at stake requires continuous attention and expertise. The Edinburgh City Archaeologist's Office plays a central role in this work. It maintains a database of known archaeological sites and finds within the city boundaries, advises on planning applications for development in archaeologically sensitive areas, and coordinates the investigation and recording of archaeological material encountered in the course of development work. The volume of this work is considerable because the Old Town generates archaeological finds on a regular basis, and each find has to be assessed and recorded and, where appropriate, investigated in more detail. The challenge is that the pace of urban development, even in a city with strong heritage protection like Edinburgh, tends to outrun the pace at which archaeological investigation can be conducted. There is a permanent tension between the needs of a functioning modern city and the requirements of archaeological preservation. This tension is not unique to Edinburgh. It is a feature of urban archaeology everywhere. But in a city where the buried fabric is as rich and as fragile as it is in Edinburgh's Old Town, the tension is particularly acute. The political context of 17th century Edinburgh is worth understanding in some depth, because it shaped the conditions in which the close communities lived and ultimately contributed to the decline of places like Mary King's Close. The Scotland of the 1640s and 1650s was not a stable or prosperous place. It was a country caught up in the most violent political upheaval it had experienced in living memory. The conflict that convulsed Britain in the 1640s, which in England is called the Civil War, and which in Scotland takes on a different character, shaped by the specific conditions of Scottish politics and religion, had profound effects on Edinburgh as the capital city of Scotland. Edinburgh was the seat of Scottish government and the centre of Scottish commercial and intellectual life, and the political crises of the mid-century touched it directly and repeatedly. The Bishops' Wars of 1639 and 1640, in which Scotland rose against King Charles I's attempts to impose Anglican forms of worship on the Scottish Church, drew Edinburgh into military conflict. The subsequent involvement of Scotland in the broader British Civil War, first as an ally of the English Parliament through the Solemn League and Covenant, and then as a contested territory occupied at various points by different armies, created conditions of extreme political and economic instability that lasted through most of the 1640s and into the 1650s. Oliver Cromwell's army occupied Edinburgh in 1650 and held it until the restoration of Charles II in 1660. Military occupation is never good for a city's commercial life, and Edinburgh's experience under Cromwellian occupation was no exception. Trade was disrupted. The normal mechanisms of civic government were compromised. The population suffered both from the direct effects of military presence and from the broader economic disruption that accompanied it. The restoration brought relief, but the relief was incomplete and temporary. The political conflicts of the 1660s and 1670s, centering on questions of religious settlement and royal authority that had never been fully resolved, produced ongoing instability in Scotland. The period known as the Killing Time in the early 1680s saw the most intense phase of repression against the Covenanting movement, with significant violence in the southwestern parts of Scotland and a climate of political fear across the country. Edinburgh, as the seat of government, was at the centre of these conflicts. The city's population was divided in its religious and political sympathies. The administration of the city was shaped by the shifting political priorities of the national government, and the economic consequences of prolonged political instability accumulated year by year, contributing to the decline of the less prosperous parts of the Old Town, even in periods when there was no acute crisis. This is the political background,
against which the decline of Mary King's Close must be understood. The Close did not decline in isolation. It declined as part of a broader pattern of economic stress and social change that affected all of Edinburgh's poorer communities in the second half of the 17th century. The plague of 1645 was the most dramatic single event in that process of decline. But it was not the only one, and understanding the political and economic context makes clear why the Close could not recover from the plague's effects in the way it might have done in more stable times. The medical reality of bubonic plague in 17th century Edinburgh is something that the popular imagination tends to get wrong in characteristic ways, and correcting those misunderstandings is important for understanding what the community of Mary King's Close actually experienced in 1645. Bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which is primarily a disease of rodents and which spreads to humans through the bite of infected fleas. The mechanism of transmission was not understood in the 17th century. The connection between rats and plague was observed empirically, in the sense that people noticed that outbreaks of plague were often preceded or accompanied by large numbers of dead rats. But the causal mechanism involving flea transmission was not established until the end of the 19th century. In the absence of this understanding, 17th century theories of plague causation focused on what we would now call environmental factors. Bad air, miasmas, the corruption of the atmosphere by rotting matter, the particular configuration of planetary influences. These theories were not entirely wrong in their practical implications, even though they were wrong in their mechanistic explanation. Environments characterized by bad air and rotting matter were, indeed, in the Edinburgh context, environments characterized by rat infestations, and therefore by high concentrations of infected fleas. The connection between the environmental conditions and the disease was real, even if the explanation for that connection was incorrect. In Edinburgh's closes, the conditions for plague transmission were near ideal. The density of the human population meant that once the disease entered a close, there was abundant opportunity for transmission through the flea bites that constituted the main route of infection. The poor sanitation meant that the organic waste that sustained rat populations was abundantly available. The relative lack of ventilation in the deeper parts of the close network meant that sick people remained in close proximity to their healthy neighbours for longer than they might have in more open environments. The clinical course of bubonic plague is rapid and dramatic. From the initial infection through the bite of an infected flea, the disease progresses over the course of 2 to 6 days to the appearance of the characteristic swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, that give the disease its name. These buboes can appear in the groin, the armpit, or the neck, depending on the location of the original flea bite, and they are extremely painful. The disease is accompanied by high fever, severe headache, and the rapid deterioration of the victim's general condition. Without treatment, bubonic plague kills between 30 and 60% of those infected. In the conditions of 17th century Edinburgh, where the general health of the population was already poor due to inadequate nutrition and the endemic burden of other infectious diseases, the mortality rate may have been at the higher end of that range. For the residents of the closes, many of whom were already nutritionally compromised and had limited resistance to infectious disease, plague was a catastrophic threat. The speed of the disease's progression meant that communities could be devastated within weeks of an outbreak beginning. A close that was fully occupied at the start of an outbreak might lose a significant fraction of its population within a month. The psychological impact of this, the terror of watching neighbours sicken and die in rapid succession, the knowledge that any day you or your family members might show the first symptoms,
was as significant as the physical toll. Edinburgh's authorities, faced with this threat, responded with the mixture of practical wisdom and brutal necessity that characterized plague management throughout the early modern period. The isolation of the sick, the quarantine of affected areas, the designation of plague grounds outside the city, these measures were not driven by any understanding of the mechanisms of disease transmission, but they were empirically effective to a degree. By removing the sick from the general population, the authorities reduced, though they could not eliminate, the opportunity for further transmission. The plague ground that served Edinburgh in 1645 was located outside the town walls, in an area that was far enough from the main settlement to serve as an effective barrier, but close enough to be reached by those who were transporting the sick. The conditions in the plague ground were terrible. The sick were housed in rough shelters with minimal facilities. Food and water were inadequate. The mortality rate among those sent to the plague ground was extremely high, not only because many of them were already seriously ill on arrival, but because the conditions of the plague ground itself were such that even those who might have survived the disease were put at risk by cold, malnutrition, and exposure. This is the reality behind the stories of people disappearing from Mary King's Close in 1645. They did not disappear because they were sealed in. Many of them disappeared because they were taken to the plague ground and did not come back. Others died in the close itself, in the early stages of the outbreak before the plague officials had established effective control. Some fled the city before the outbreak reached them and never returned because they found better situations elsewhere, or because the disruption of flight separated them from their homes permanently. The close that emerged from 1645 was a diminished place. Not empty, not sealed, not abandoned, but diminished, with gaps in its population that would prove difficult to fill, with a reputation that made it less attractive to new residents, with physical fabric that was beginning to show the effects of the neglect that comes when a community loses a significant portion of its population, and with it, a significant portion of the energy and attention that maintains a shared environment. The geological character of Edinburgh is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the underground city story, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives. The rock beneath Edinburgh's Old Town is not a uniform substance. It is a complex assemblage of different geological materials, laid down over hundreds of millions of years, and then modified by the volcanic activity and glacial erosion that gave the city its distinctive topography. The core of the ridge on which the Old Town sits is formed by the hard basalt of ancient lava flows, the material that makes up the castle rock, and that forms the spine of the ridge along much of its length. This basalt is extremely hard and extremely stable. It does not erode quickly. It does not compress under load. It does not allow water to pass through it easily. It is, in short, an ideal foundation for urban construction, and the durability of Edinburgh's Old Town buildings is partly a function of the exceptional quality of the rock on which they stand. But the ridge is not entirely basalt. Along its flanks and in the closes that descend from the ridgetop into the valleys on either side, the geology becomes more complex. There are layers of softer sedimentary rock interbedded with the harder volcanic material. There are areas where the surface deposits are made up of the glacial till left behind by the retreating ice sheets of the last glaciation, a mixture of clay and sand and gravel that is much more variable in its properties than the solid basalt. The geology of the northern face of the ridge, where the closes descended most steeply and where Mary King's Close is located, is particularly complex. The rapid descent from the ridgetop to the lower ground of what is now Princes Street meant that the buildings in the closes on the northern side were constructed on a variety of different geological foundations, some stable and some less so. The buildings closest to the ridgetop sat on solid rock. The buildings further down the slope sat on a mixture of rock and deposited material that was less predictable in its behavior. This geological variability is one of the reasons why the preservation of the underground spaces in Edinburgh is not uniform. The rooms that sit on solid rock have remained stable. The rooms that sit on less stable ground have been affected to varying degrees by settling and by the movement of water through the deposits beneath them. The particular combination of geological factors that produced the good preservation of Mary King's Close is not replicated exactly throughout the underground network. The water that flows through Edinburgh's subsurface is another geological factor of considerable importance for the underground. The Old Town sits on a ridge that collects rainfall from a relatively large catchment area, and that rainfall has to go somewhere. Before the construction of Edinburgh's modern drainage system, which was largely a product of the Victorian period, the movement of water through the subsurface was largely uncontrolled. Water percolated through the surface deposits, moved along the surfaces of the underlying rock, and eventually emerged at the base of the ridge in springs and seeps. The wells within Edinburgh's closes tapped into this subsurface water flow. The well in Mary King's Close was not drawing from a discrete underground aquifer in the way that a well in flat terrain might be. It was intercepting the lateral flow of water through the rock and deposits of the ridge, collecting it at a point where it could be drawn to the surface. The availability and quality of this water was variable, depending on the amount of recent rainfall and on the degree to which the surface sources of the water had been contaminated by the waste disposal practices of the city above. The contamination of Edinburgh's subsurface water supply by the city's waste was a problem that grew more severe as the city's population increased. By the 17th century, the well water in many parts of the Old Town was of dubious quality, and episodes of waterborne disease, particularly typhoid and dysentery, were common. The distinction between plague and these endemic waterborne diseases was not always clear to contemporaries, and some of the mortality that was attributed to plague in Edinburgh's historical records may actually have been the result of contaminated water supplies. Understanding this geological context does not change the fundamental story of Mary King's Close, but it enriches it. It reminds us that the close existed within a physical environment that was not simply a neutral backdrop to human activity, but an active participant in the lives of the people who lived there, shaping their access to water, determining the stability of their buildings, influencing the degree to which their underground spaces would survive the centuries. The social history of Edinburgh's Old Town in the 17th century cannot be separated from the history of its built environment, and the built environment cannot be understood without the geological foundation on which it rests. The underground city is not just an archaeological site, it is a geological site, a hydrological site, a historical site, and a social site, all at once. And understanding it fully requires holding all of these dimensions in mind simultaneously. The rediscovery of Mary King's Close as a subject of popular interest in the 19th century was not an isolated phenomenon. It was part of a broader cultural movement, characteristic of the Victorian period, in which the past was being rediscovered, romanticized, and, in some cases, invented. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries had created an appetite for the picturesque, for the dramatic, for the ruin and the fragment that spoke of vanished greatness. Edinburgh's underground fitted perfectly into this aesthetic framework. The city itself was undergoing dramatic transformation in this period. The construction of Edinburgh's new town, which had begun in the 1760s and continued into the 19th century, had provided the city's wealthier residents with an alternative to the crowded and deteriorating Old Town. The new town was a planned development of Georgian streets and squares, laid out on a rational grid to the north of the Old Town, built in the neoclassical style, and designed to provide exactly the kind of airy, spacious, well-serviced urban environment that the Old Town's closes could not offer. The existence of the new town through the character of the Old Town
into sharp relief. The contrast between the planned rationality of the new town and the organic complexity of the old town was immediately apparent to anyone who moved between them. And that contrast was the subject of considerable comment and reflection in the early 19th century. Writers like Robert Chambers found in the Old Town a repository of historical atmosphere and social depth that the New Town, for all its architectural elegance, entirely lacked. It was in this context that the underground closes became a subject of popular fascination. They represented the Old Town at its most extreme, the most hidden, the most forgotten, the most historically atmospheric of all the spaces that the new city was in the process of superseding. For readers who felt that the rational modernity of the new town was somehow lacking in the richness and complexity that the old town offered in abundance, the underground was the ultimate expression of that richness. It was the old town taken to its logical extreme, a city beneath the city, a past beneath the present. The ghost stories that attached themselves to Mary King's Close in this period were products of the same cultural moment. The Victorian interest in the paranormal, in spiritualism, in the stories of the dead communicating with the living, found in the underground close an ideal setting. A sealed space with a history of plague and death, a place that the city above had forgotten, but that had not forgotten the city. It was the perfect environment for a ghost story. And ghost stories were told about it, and those stories became part of the popular understanding of the close, layered over the historical reality in ways that were difficult to disentangle. Some of the ghost stories are transparently fictional, clearly inventions of the Victorian period with no historical foundation whatsoever. Others are more interesting, representing folk traditions that may preserve some kind of cultural memory of the close's history, even if they are not literally accurate. The stories of the ghost of a young girl named Annie, who is perhaps the most famous of the Mary King's Close supernatural traditions, are of uncertain origin, but have become deeply embedded in the popular culture surrounding the site. Whether any of these stories are true in any literal sense is a question that this documentary has no interest in adjudicating. What is historically interesting about the ghost stories is not their truth value, but their cultural function. They are the means by which a society that had largely forgotten the history of the close kept some connection to it, transmitted some awareness of its existence and its character across generations that had no access to the scholarly record. In this sense, the ghost stories of Mary King's Close are themselves historical documents, not of the 17th century, but of the 19th. They tell us about the Victorian understanding of history and the supernatural, about the ways in which a city processes its own past when formal historical scholarship is not available to do that processing, and about the persistent human need to maintain a connection to the places where others have lived and suffered and died. The formal opening of Mary King's Close as a managed visitor attraction in 2003 brought these various threads together in a new form. The attraction presents the close to its visitors through a combination of historical interpretation and theatrical storytelling, using guides in period costume and dramatized elements alongside more straightforwardly historical information. This approach has been successful in commercial terms. The close is among Edinburgh's most popular visitor attractions and draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The question of whether this success comes at a historical cost is one that continues to generate debate among historians and heritage professionals. The theatrical elements of the visitor experience, including the ghost stories and the dramatized reconstructions of 17th century life, risk creating in visitors a sense of historical understanding that is actually a mixture of accurate information and fictional embellishment, with the two components not always clearly distinguished. At the same time, the visitor attraction has funded ongoing conservation work at the site and has maintained public interest in the history of Edinburgh's underground in ways that purely scholarly attention could not have achieved. The thousands of people who visit the close each year and who leave with some sense of the history of the place and of the community that once lived there represent an engagement with history that is valuable, even if it is not perfectly accurate in all its details. The history of Mary King's Close is ultimately a history of ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, living their lives in a city that was both remarkable and brutal, that offered community and belonging alongside poverty and disease, that preserved their existence in an underground chamber for centuries after they were gone, and then offered that preserved existence to a curious modern world that found in it something it needed. What that something is varies from visitor to visitor, from historian to historian, from generation to generation. For some, it is the simple fascination of the hidden and the forgotten. For some, it is a connection to ancestors who might have lived in similar circumstances in similar cities across the span of history. For some, it is a reminder of the contingency of historical survival, the way in which what we know about the past is shaped by the accidents of preservation, as much as by the importance of what actually happened. For all of these responses, and for the many others that the close generates in those who encounter it, the place has value. Not just as an archaeological site, not just as a tourist attraction, but as a place where the past and the present coexist in an unusually immediate way, where the centuries compress and the distance between now and then becomes, for a moment, something that can be touched. What Edinburgh's underground also reveals, in ways that comparative analysis makes clearer, is the specific role that institutional memory plays in the survival of buried spaces. In Rome and Istanbul, the underground environments that survive best are typically those that were maintained by powerful institutions: the church, the imperial government, the wealthy aristocracy, whose continuity across centuries meant that someone always knew what was there and had an interest in preserving access to it. The Byzantine cisterns beneath Istanbul survive in part because they were used and maintained throughout the Byzantine period, and because the Ottoman authorities who inherited the city recognized their utility and kept them in at least partial operation. Mary King's Close has no such institutional patron. It survived not because any institution cared about it, but because no institution cared enough about it to disturb it. Its preservation is a preservation by default, a survival through irrelevance. And this makes it different in character from institutionally maintained underground spaces. It is more genuinely forgotten, more authentically abandoned, and in some ways more historically legible because of it. The spaces that powerful institutions maintain tend to be modified by that maintenance. Cisterns are repaired, extended, altered to serve changing needs. Crypts are reorganized as burials accumulate. Even the most venerable institutional underground space shows the marks of the ongoing use and attention it has received. Mary King's Close shows none of these marks, or very few of them. It shows instead the marks of the community that abandoned it, the things left behind, the surfaces that were never updated, the fixtures that were never replaced. It is an image of departure rather than of maintenance, and that image is more rare and more revealing than it might at first appear. The study of departure is not a well-developed branch of historical scholarship, but it should be. The things that people leave behind when they leave a place tell a different story from the things that are found in places that were continuously occupied.
When a community abandons a space in the gradual way that the community of Mary King's Close abandoned their close, they do not make a clean break. They leave incrementally, taking what matters most and leaving what matters less. And the things they leave are a record of their priorities and their circumstances at the moment of departure. The pottery fragments found in Mary King's Close were left because they were broken and worthless. The structural fixtures, the fireplaces, the well, were left because they could not be taken. The plaster on the walls was left because it was part of the building rather than the contents. And the arrangement of all these things, frozen at the moment of final abandonment, is a document of that abandonment in the most literal sense. It is not a record of how the close was at its height. It is a record of how it was at its end. And that record is historically unique. The people who left Mary King's Close were leaving a place that had been their community's home for generations. Some of them had been born there. Some of them had buried their parents and their children in the ground outside the close, in the playgrounds or in the churchyards of the old town. The close was not just a collection of rooms to them. It was the physical container of their social world, and leaving it was a loss that the documentary record cannot fully capture. We tend to think of urban history as the history of buildings and streets and institutions. But it is also, and perhaps more fundamentally, the history of communities. The networks of relationship and dependency and mutual knowledge that form among people who share a place. The community of Mary King's Close was one such network. It formed over generations. It was damaged by plague and poverty and the slow attrition of hard lives, and it eventually dispersed entirely. And what remains in the sealed rooms beneath the city chambers is the shell that community once inhabited. That shell is worth preserving. It is worth studying. It is worth the effort of scholarship and the investment of conservation resources. Not because it is grand or beautiful or the site of important political events, but because it is the physical record of lives that were as real and as full as any others in the historical record, and that deserve to be known. The close is still there. The rooms are still waiting, and the city above goes on. If you found yourself pulled into the quiet strangeness of this history, hit subscribe. There are more places like this, buried beneath more cities, waiting to be understood. We cover them here, one at a time, without rushing.